The twins watched through the glass partition as the man in the $1,000 suit threw away more money in one phone call than their father made in 6 months. But they also saw him wipe away a tear when he thought no one was looking. Welcome back, beautiful souls. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind and you won't want to miss it. Tonight, a billionaire, two brilliant kids, and a poker game that changes everything. Let's begin. The 42nd floor corner office of Coleman Industries overlooked a city that Richard Coleman owned piece by piece, but tonight it felt like a glass cage. The mahogany desk, polished to mirror perfection, reflected his tired face as he ended another call that had cost him nothing and gained him less. Outside, Manhattan glittered with 1,000 promises he'd already bought and found empty. "Mr. Coleman," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your car is waiting." Rich pressed the button with a finger that wore a platinum ring worth more than most people's homes. "Tell James to go home to his family. I'll call a cab." Silence stretched across the line. In 3 years, he'd never dismissed his driver early. "Sir, are you—" "Good night, Patricia." He clicked off and stood, his Italian leather shoes soundless on Persian rugs that had witnessed 1,000 lonely evenings. The framed photo on his desk caught the lamplight. A younger version of himself with his father, both wearing forced smiles at some charity gala. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, but Rich remembered how it had felt like a weight, not comfort. The whiskey decanter called to him from the bar cart, but he'd learned that drowning in amber only made the silence louder. Instead, he gathered his coat and headed for the elevator, pressing the button for the parking garage where his BMW waited like a faithful but emotionless companion. 42 floors below, in the building's basement, David Martinez was teaching his twins the most important lesson he knew. "Mijo, mija," he said in Spanish, his weathered hands gentle as he cleaned the mop. "What did you see today?" Alex, 11 years old with eyes that missed nothing, glanced up from the homework spread across the break room table. The lady in 4B threw away a sandwich that still had the wrapper on it. "And," David prompted, knowing his son had seen more. "She was crying when she threw it away," Maya added softly, her twin intuition filling the gaps. "Not hungry crying, sad crying." David nodded, pride swelling in his chest. His children saw what others missed, the stories behind the surface. It was a gift born of necessity. When you cleaned up after the wealthy, you learned to read the signs, the hastily discarded tissues that spoke of tears, the untouched meals that revealed loss of appetite, the family photos turned face down in moments of grief. "People think money fixes everything," David said, switching to English for the lesson he needed them to understand in both languages. "But pain is pain, no matter what kind of shoes you wear." The twins exchanged a look, that silent twin communication that had amazed him since they were babies. They understood more than children their age should have to. "Is that why you never take anything?" Alex asked. "Even when they throw away stuff that's perfectly good?" David's hand stilled on the mop handle. His children had noticed his strict code. Observe, clean, respect, but never take. Not even the discarded treasures that could have made their lives easier. "We earn what we have," he said simply. "Dignity isn't for sale." Maya looked up from her math homework, advanced calculus that she'd borrowed from the public library because her school didn't offer it. "Papa, what if someone offered us something? Like really offered, not throwing away?" "Depends on why they're offering, mija. People give gifts for different reasons. Some give because they care. Others give because they want something back, or because it makes them feel powerful." He sat down across from them, his janitor's uniform rumpled but clean. "You two are smart enough to know the difference." The elevator dinged in the distance and David stood automatically. The building should have been empty by now, but sometimes the executives work late. He'd learned to make himself invisible during these moments. Just another piece of the building's machinery. "Pack up your homework," he said quietly. "Time to finish the north wing." But as they gathered their books, Maya grabbed Alex's arm, her eyes wide. Through the small window in the break room door, they could see the elevator doors sliding open. "What do you think drives people to give? Genuine kindness or hidden motives? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. The man who stepped out wasn't just any executive. It was Richard Coleman himself, looking lost in his own building, and in his hand, he carried something the twins had seen him hold every night for the past month. A photograph he thought no one noticed, one that he stared at when he thought the world wasn't watching. The same photograph that David had seen him accidentally drop 2 weeks ago, the one that had revealed a secret that could change everything. David's breath caught. The twins had seen it too, their sharp eyes taking in details that adults dismissed. They knew what the photograph meant, what it revealed about the powerful man who owned everything around them. And now Richard Coleman was walking directly toward the break room where they sat, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, like a countdown to a moment that would intertwine their worlds in ways none of them could predict. The twins looked at their father, then at each other, their young minds already calculating the possibilities of what was about to unfold. Richard Coleman stopped 3 feet from the break room door, his hand trembling slightly as he clutched the photograph. Through the small window, he could see the janitor and his children, the ones he'd passed hundreds of times without really seeing. Tonight, something was different. Tonight, the walls he'd built around himself felt paper thin. The break room door creaked as he pushed it open. David Martinez looked up, instinctively rising from his chair, but Richard raised a hand to stop him. "Please, don't get up." His voice came out rougher than intended. "I'm sorry to interrupt." The twins, he'd never learned their names, stared at him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. They weren't looking at his expensive suit or his power. They were looking at him, the real him, the one hiding behind the photograph in his trembling hand. "Mr. Coleman," David said carefully, "is everything all right?" Richard almost laughed. When was the last time someone had asked him that question and actually wanted to hear the answer? His board members asked it as a formality. His therapist asked it for $200 an hour. But this man, this janitor, asked it like it mattered. "I dot." Richard started, then stopped. The twins were still watching him, their dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that unsettled him. "I was wondering if you and your children might join me for something." The silence stretched between them like a tightrope. David's protective instincts were clearly on high alert, while the twins exchanged one of their mysterious looks. "Sir, we appreciate any offer, but—" "Poker," Richard interrupted, the word tumbling out before he could stop it. "I was wondering if you'd like to play poker." The absurdity of it hit the room like a physical force. A billionaire CEO asking a janitor and 2 11-year-olds to play cards at 11 p.m. in an office building. But Richard couldn't take it back now, and strangely, he didn't want to. "I have a table upstairs in my office," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "Nothing serious, just cards, company." Maya tilted her head, studying him with the analytical precision of a detective. "What kind of poker?" Her father shot her a warning look, but Richard found himself smiling, the first genuine smile he'd worn in weeks. "What kind do you know?" "Texas Hold'em, 7-card stud, 5-card draw." Alex rattled off casually, as if listing his favorite snacks. "Maya's better at reading tells, but I'm better at calculating odds." David's jaw tightened. "Kids, Mr. Coleman doesn't need to—" "Actually, I do." The words escaped Richard's chest like a confession. "I need to very much." The photograph in his hand caught the fluorescent light, and he saw Maya's eyes flick to it, then to her brother. Another one of those silent twin communications passed between them, and Richard felt a chill of recognition. They knew something. Something about the photograph, about him, about secrets he thought he'd buried. "Mr. Coleman," Maya said softly, her voice carrying a gentleness that reminded him of someone he'd tried to forget. "Are you lonely?" The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was intrusive, but because it was true, and because it was asked with the kind of honest compassion he hadn't heard since Emily died. His throat constricted around her name, the name he hadn't spoken aloud in 3 years. His daughter, his brilliant, beautiful, poker-playing daughter who would have been the twins' age now if the cancer hadn't taken her. The twins saw the recognition in his eyes. They saw him seeing them, really seeing them for the first time. And in that moment, David understood too. The photograph, the late nights, the sudden invitation. This wasn't about poker. "Papa," Alex whispered in Spanish. He's hurting like you hurt when Mama was in the hospital. David's expression softened, paternal instinct overriding caution. He looked at Richard Coleman, not the billionaire, not the boss, but the broken father holding a photograph like a lifeline. The kids are good at cards, David said quietly. Almost too good. I can see that, Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. Would you consider it? Just one game? Maya stood up from the table, her homework forgotten. She walked over to Richard, stopping just close enough that her voice would reach him, but not close enough to crowd him. Mr. Coleman, we know about your daughter. The words hung in the air like a held breath. Richard's face went white, then red, then white again. The photograph crinkled in his tightening grip. We know, Alex added gently, because you carry her picture the same way Papa carried Mama's when she was sick. What do you think it takes for someone to truly heal? Time alone or connection with others who understand? Share your thoughts below. David closed his eyes, understanding flooding through him. The twins had seen what he'd been too focused on work to notice. The powerful man who owned everything was drowning in the same grief that had nearly claimed David 2 years ago. She taught me poker, Richard whispered, his voice breaking. Emily. She was so smart. Just like... He looked at the twins, seeing his daughter's curious eyes reflected in theirs. She would have liked you both. The break room filled with a silence that wasn't empty but full of recognition, of shared pain, of the possibility that some wounds could only heal when witnessed by those who understood. And in that silence, the twins made a decision that would change everything. We'll play, Maya said simply. But fair warning, Mr. Coleman, we really are good at reading tells. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending into a different atmosphere, one where vulnerability was a liability and emotions were weapons. With each floor that passed, Richard Coleman's walls rebuilt themselves, brick by defensive brick. By the time the doors opened to reveal his executive suite, the broken father from the break room had vanished, replaced by the CEO who'd learned that showing weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. Welcome to Coleman Industries executive level, he said, his voice now carrying the polished distance of a tour guide. The poker table is in the conference room. David noticed the change immediately. The man who had whispered his daughter's name was gone, replaced by someone performing the role of gracious host. His protective instincts flared. Mr. Coleman, David said carefully, if this isn't a good time... Nonsense. Richard's smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem genuine, cold enough to maintain control. I invited you. Besides, I'm curious to see if your children are as skilled as they claim. The twins exchanged a look. In the space of an elevator ride, the grieving father had transformed into someone testing them, evaluating them. Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that Alex recognized as her preparation for battle. The conference room was a monument to power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a mahogany table that could seat 20, and in the center a professional poker table that looked like it had never been used for anything but intimidation. Impressive, Alex said, but his tone carried an edge that made David glance sharply at him. It should be. It cost more than most people make in 5 years. Richard's words carried a casual cruelty that hadn't been there downstairs. He was reminding them of their place, of the vast gulf between their worlds. Maya walked to the windows, pretending to admire the view while actually studying Richard's reflection in the glass. Must get lonely up here, she said quietly. All these windows, but no one to share the view with. The barb found its mark. Richard's hands clenched briefly before he forced them to relax. I prefer solitude, he lied. It's more efficient. David's protective instincts went into overdrive. This wasn't the broken man who had asked for company. This was someone playing games, and his children were the pieces. Kids, maybe we should... No. Maya turned from the window, her young face set with determination. We said we'd play. We keep our word. But Alex was already calculating odds that had nothing to do with cards. The man who had shown them vulnerability was now hiding behind wealth and power, using their economic difference as a shield. It was a tell as clear as any facial expression. What are the stakes? Alex asked, settling into a chair at the poker table with the confidence of someone who'd never been intimidated by money. Richard paused in shuffling the cards, professional-grade Copag playing cards that cost more than David's monthly grocery budget. The question was simple, but Alex's tone suggested it was really about something else entirely. Money seems inappropriate, Richard said carefully, given the circumstances. Afraid we can't afford to lose. Maya's voice was deceptively sweet, but David recognized the steel underneath. His daughter was angry, and when Maya was angry, she became dangerously smart. Of course not. You meant you could buy and sell our family 1,000 times over, Alex interrupted, his mathematical mind cutting straight to the core. You meant we should be grateful for the charity of being allowed to breathe the same air as Richard Coleman. The room fell silent except for the whisper of expensive air conditioning. David's face went pale. His children had never spoken to authority this way, never challenged anyone with such direct confrontation, but Richard didn't explode with indignation as expected. Instead, something flickered across his features, recognition, maybe even respect. You're angry, he observed. You showed us your heart, Maya said simply. Then you decided that was a mistake. The accusation hung between them like a challenge. Richard set down the cards, his practiced composure cracking. You don't understand the position I'm in, the responsibilities. We understand perfectly, Alex cut him off. You're scared that you let us see you're human. David stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. That's enough. We're leaving. But as he moved toward the door, Richard's voice stopped him. Not the commanding tone of a CEO, but something closer to desperation. The building's in lockdown. They turned confused. Security protocol, Richard continued, not meeting their eyes. After 11 p.m., no one leaves without executive authorization. Insurance liability. It was a lie, and they all knew it. The building had no such protocol, but it was Richard's way of saying what he couldn't bring himself to admit. He didn't want them to leave. He needed them to stay, even if he couldn't lower his defenses enough to ask properly. Maya studied his face in the reflection of the dark windows. So we're trapped here with you until you decide to let us go? It's not like that. It's exactly like that, Alex said, but his anger was fading, replaced by something else. You invited us to play poker, then decided you needed to stay in control instead of staying real. How do you think walls we build to protect ourselves end up becoming prisons instead? Share your experience below. David sank into a chair, exhaustion replacing anger. His children were right, but that didn't make the situation any less impossible. They were trapped in a room with a man who had shown them his vulnerability, then immediately armored himself against it. But the twins weren't finished. They had come this far, and they had seen something in Richard Coleman that he was now trying to deny. If he wanted to play games instead of being honest, they would play games, and they would play to win. Deal the cards, Maya said, settling into her chair with the cold determination of a professional. Let's see what you're really made of, Mr. Coleman. The first hand was supposed to be simple, a warm-up to ease into the game. Richard dealt 5-card draw, keeping the stakes low and the mood light, but within minutes he realized he'd made a fundamental miscalculation. These weren't children playing at cards. These were predators disguised as 11-year-olds. Maya discarded 2 cards with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Alex kept his face perfectly neutral, but his fingers drummed a subtle rhythm on the table, a pattern that Richard initially dismissed as nervous energy until he realized it was actually Maya's cards being communicated in some kind of twin code. I'll take 3, David said, and Richard noticed how the man's weathered hands handled the cards with surprising dexterity. This family had clearly played together before. Dealer takes 2, Richard announced, trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away from him. The betting round began innocuously enough. Maya opened with a modest amount, Alex folded, David called, and Richard raised. Not enough to hurt anyone, but enough to establish dominance. Maya looked at him across the table, her dark eyes completely unreadable. Call your raise and bump it up. The words were casual, but something in her tone made Richard's skin prickle. She wasn't just playing cards. She was studying him like a lab specimen. David shot his daughter a warning look. Maya, remember what we talked about? About being respectful? She interrupted, never taking her eyes off Richard. Or about recognizing when someone's trying to buy their way out of an uncomfortable situation? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Richard felt heat creep up his neck. She was right, and they both knew it. He'd raised not because of his cards, but because spending money was the only way he knew how to regain control. That's quite an accusation from someone who hasn't even shown her cards yet, he said, forcing his voice to remain level. Maya smiled, not the innocent grin of a child, but something sharper. Mr. Coleman, you've been touching your watch every time you're unsure about something. When you raised just now, you touched it 3 times. That's not confidence. That's anxiety dressed up as power. Richard's hand froze halfway to his wrist. He hadn't even realized he'd been doing it. Alex leaned back in his chair, studying the interaction with analytical precision. Maya notices the small things. I notice the patterns. Like how you shuffle the cards exactly 17 times before each deal, but when you're nervous, you add 3 extra shuffles. And when you're thinking about your daughter, Maya added quietly, you hold the cards the way she probably taught you, low and close to your chest, like you're protecting something precious. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Emily had taught him that grip during their Sunday afternoon games, insisting that cards should be held like secrets, Daddy, close enough to keep safe, loose enough to let go when it's time. David set down his cards, his protective instincts now in full alarm. Kids, that's enough. But Richard held up a hand, stopping him. For the first time since they'd entered his domain, he looked genuinely curious rather than defensive. How long have you been watching me? The twins exchanged another of their silent communications before Alex answered. 2 months, ever since you started working late every Thursday. Thursdays, Maya continued, were poker nights with Emily. We know because you keep her cards in your desk drawer, and you take them out every Thursday at exactly 8:47 p.m. Richard's breath caught. How could you possibly? The security cameras don't reach your desk, but they catch the reflection in your office window, Alex explained matter-of-factly. Maya figured out what you were holding by watching the reflection's reflection in the building across the street. With binoculars, Maya added helpfully, from Papa's cleaning cart. David buried his face in his hands. Dios mío, what have you two done? But Richard was staring at the twins with something approaching awe. You've been conducting surveillance on me for 2 months? Not surveillance, Maya corrected. Research. There's a difference. We wanted to understand why the most powerful man in the building cried every Thursday night, Alex said simply, and why he always held the same 5 cards. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 42 floors below. Richard set down his cards, his hands trembling slightly. The same 5 cards? Maya nodded. The ones in your wallet, behind your driver's license. A straight flush in hearts. 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace. Emily's last hand before she got too sick to play. The words were spoken with such gentle precision that they bypassed all of Richard's defenses. His carefully constructed walls crumbled, and he was once again just a father missing his daughter. She was so proud of that hand, he whispered, said it was proof that sometimes beautiful things happen when you least expect them. David's anger melted into something closer to understanding. These weren't just smart children. They were empathetic souls who had recognized pain and decided to try to understand it. What do you think? Is it better to grieve alone or to have others witness your pain? Drop your thoughts below. We know it's in your wallet because you touch your jacket pocket every time you think about her, Alex said softly. Same spot, same gesture, like you're making sure she's still there. Richard's hand moved unconsciously to his jacket pocket, then stopped. They had read him completely, not just his poker tells, but his grief, his habits, his desperate need to keep his daughter close. You know my secret hand, he said finally. We know all your hands, Maya replied. The cards you play and the pain you carry. The question is, what are you going to do now that you know we know? The poker game had become something else entirely, not a contest of cards, but a negotiation of souls. And Richard Coleman, for the first time in 3 years, felt like he might not have to carry his secrets alone. Richard Coleman stared at the cards in his hand, meaningless now that the game had become something else entirely. His fingers found the straight flush in his wallet, the laminated cards that had traveled with him for 3 years, growing soft around the edges from countless desperate touches. "She beat me with this hand," he said quietly, pulling out the 5 cards and laying them on the mahogany table. They looked fragile against the expensive wood, like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. September 15th, 2022. 3 days before the words stuck in his throat like broken glass. Maya reached across the table, not to touch the cards, but to hover her small hand just above them, close enough to honor them, distant enough to respect their sanctity. "Tell us about her," she said simply. And for the first time in 3 years, Richard Coleman did. "Emily was everything I wasn't," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Curious instead of calculating, brave instead of cautious. She saw magic where I saw mathematics." He touched the ace of hearts gently. "I taught her poker because I thought it would teach her about risk management, probability, strategic thinking, all the things a good businessman needs to know." A smile ghosted across his features, the first real smile they'd seen from him. "Instead, she taught me that sometimes the best play isn't the smart play. It's the one that makes your opponent smile." His voice cracked. "She used to let me win just often enough to keep me interested, but not so often that I'd get suspicious. It took me 2 years to realize she was managing me, not the other way around." David leaned forward, recognition flickering in his eyes. "How old was she?" 8 when we started playing. 11 when—" Richard's hands clenched. "Leukemia. Acute lymphoblastic. The doctors said we caught it early, that children her age had a 90% survival rate. We had the best medical team money could buy, experimental treatments, everything." Alex's mathematical mind was already working. "But she was in the 10%. Richard nodded, unable to speak. The silence stretched until David's voice cut through it, rough with his own remembered pain. "Maria was diagnosed with cervical cancer when the twins were 9, he said quietly. "We couldn't afford the best doctors, the experimental treatments. We had Medicaid and prayer and each other." Richard looked up, surprised by the parallel revelation. David continued, "The kids learned to read people because they had to. When you're watching your mother fade away, you become an expert at reading pain, at seeing the things adults try to hide. They watched me pretend to be strong when I was breaking apart inside." Maya's voice was soft but steady. "Mama made it through the treatments. She's in remission now, living with Abuela in Phoenix. But for 8 months, we lived every day wondering if it would be the last one." "That's why you watch people so carefully," Richard realized. "You're looking for signs of pain because you've learned that pain hides. And because," Alex added, "when someone is hurting the way you hurt, they need to know they're not alone, even if they don't know how to ask for help." Richard stared at these 2 children who had diagnosed his grief with surgical precision and offered companionship instead of pity. The poker cards on the table suddenly felt like a bridge instead of a barrier. "Emily's last good day," he continued, his voice stronger now. "She insisted we play poker. She was so weak the cards kept slipping from her hands, but she refused to quit. Said she had something to prove." He touched the straight flush again, as if drawing strength from the memory. "She'd been working on this hand for weeks, practicing the shuffles and deals when the nurses weren't looking. She wanted to deal me the perfect hand, not to win, but to show me that beautiful things could still happen even when everything else was falling apart." Tears ran down his cheeks now, but he didn't wipe them away. "She dealt herself garbage cards on purpose, a 2, a 7, a 9, a jack, and a 3, all different suits, the worst possible hand. But she played it like she had royal flush, bluffing and raising and grinning at me with that smile that could light up the whole oncology ward." David's own eyes were wet now, understanding the profound gift Emily had given her father. When she finally showed her cards and lost, she looked at me and said, "Daddy, sometimes losing is just another way of winning. I got to make you happy for 2 whole hours, and that's better than any pot." The room filled with the kind of silence that holds space for grief without trying to fix it. Maya wiped her own tears with the back of her hand. "She sounds like she was really smart." "Smarter than me," Richard agreed. "I've spent 3 years trying to figure out what she meant about losing being another way of winning. I thought maybe if I made enough money, donated enough to children's hospitals, built enough scholarship funds in her name, I could turn her loss into some kind of victory." "But that's not what she meant," Alex said gently. Richard looked at him, waiting. "She meant that loving someone, really loving them, is winning even when you lose them, because you get to carry the love forever. Have you ever found unexpected wisdom in loss? Sometimes our deepest pain teaches us our greatest truths." Share your thoughts below. The poker table had become an altar of shared grief. The expensive conference room transformed into a sacred space where 3 broken hearts had found each other across the vast divide of class and circumstance. And in that moment, Richard Coleman realized that his daughter's final lesson was finally beginning to make sense. For the first time since they had entered the conference room, the cards were just cards again. Maya shuffled them with the casual expertise of someone who'd learned from watching her parents' weekly games, while Alex calculated splits for the pretzels they'd found in Richard's desk drawer. Apparently, even billionaire CEOs kept snacks hidden away. "Emily would have loved you too," Richard said, settling back into his chair with something approaching peace. The laminated straight flush lay beside his regular cards now, no longer a secret but a shared memory. "What was she like?" Maya asked, dealing a fresh hand of 7-card stud. "When she wasn't being a poker shark, I mean." Richard's laugh surprised them all, including himself. "She was terrible at everything except being wonderful. Couldn't ride a bike without training wheels until she was 10, but she could explain quantum physics to her stuffed animals. She once convinced her entire 3rd-grade class that I was secretly Batman because I worked late and wore dark suits." "Were you?" Alex asked with perfect seriousness. "I couldn't even convince her to eat vegetables. Batman would have had better negotiation skills." David found himself smiling despite everything. "Maria used to tell the twins I was El Luchador, the mysterious wrestler who cleaned buildings by night and fought crime by day." "Papa still has his mask," Maya confided with a grin. "Maya!" "What?" "It's cute that you kept it. Mama bought it for you for Halloween the year she was in treatment. You wore it to make her laugh during chemo." The easy back and forth felt natural now, like they'd been playing cards together for years instead of hours. Richard found himself remembering what it felt like to be part of a family conversation, the gentle teasing and shared stories that had died with Emily. "Your turn to ante up," Alex announced, pushing a small pile of pretzels toward the center of the table. "But fair warning, Maya's got her thinking face on." "I do not have a thinking face," Maya protested. "You scrunch your nose exactly like Papa does when he's calculating the square footage of a building." Alex informed Richard conspiratorially, "It's genetic." David touched his nose self-consciously. "I do not scrunch." "Papa, you scrunch so hard sometimes we're afraid you're going to pull a muscle," Maya said, then immediately scrunched her own nose in concentration as she studied her cards. Richard felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness that had been there so long he'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be permanent. This was what Emily would have wanted for him. Not the isolation of grief, but the warmth of connection with people who understood that love and loss were just different sides of the same coin. "I'll see your 3 pretzels and raise you 4, he said, pushing his snacks forward with mock seriousness. "Ooh, high roller," Maya teased. "Alex, should we be worried about Papa's gambling addiction?" "I'm more worried about Mr. Coleman's," Alex replied thoughtfully. "He's got tells, but they're not about the cards. They're about us." Richard paused mid-reach for his wallet. "What do you mean?" "When Maya makes you smile, you touch Emily's cards," Alex explained gently. "When Papa talks about family, you look at the photo on your desk. You're not playing poker with us. You're playing poker with ghosts." The observation wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact in the way that only children could manage, but it hit Richard with the force of absolute truth. I suppose I am, he admitted. For 3 years, I've been playing against memories. Tonight's the first time I've played with living people. Maya set down her cards and looked at him directly. So what's it like? Playing with us instead of against them? Richard considered the question seriously. Terrifying, he said finally, and wonderful. And absolutely nothing like I expected when I invited you up here. What did you expect? David asked. Honestly, I thought I could control it. Use you as... He stopped, embarrassed. As what? Maya pressed. As therapy, he admitted. I thought if I could play cards with children again, maybe I could find some kind of closure. Maybe prove to myself that I could be around kids without falling apart. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that held space for truth-telling. And instead, Alex prompted, instead I found out that healing isn't something you do alone, and it's not something you can buy or control or strategize your way through. Richard looked at each of them in turn. Emily used to say that the best hands weren't the ones you planned, but the ones you were brave enough to play when you didn't know how they'd turn out. David leaned forward, his weathered hands steady on the table. Richard, can I ask you something? The use of his first name felt like a gift. Of course. What happens tomorrow? When we go back to being the janitor and his kids and you go back to being the CEO who owns the building? What do you think happens when people from different worlds connect deeply? Can those bonds survive when they return to their separate realities? Share your thoughts below. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Richard realized that David had identified the fundamental flaw in this magical evening. Tomorrow, the elevator would carry them back to their separate floors, their separate lives, their separate social strata. The poker table would be cleared away, and the distance between the executive suite and the basement would feel infinite again. I don't know, Richard said honestly, but I know I don't want to go back to Thursday nights alone with Emily's cards. Maya and Alex exchanged one of their looks, the kind that seemed to communicate entire conversations in a glance. Then don't, Maya said simply. Every Thursday at 8:47, we'll be in the break room doing homework. Papa's shift ends at 10. If you want to play cards with living people instead of ghosts, you know where to find us. It was an invitation that offered everything and demanded nothing. No charity, no pity, just the simple promise of ongoing connection. And for the first time in 3 years, Richard Coleman began to believe that Thursday nights didn't have to be about ending something. They could be about beginning something new. The phone's sharp ring cut through the warmth like a blade through silk. Richard glanced at the caller ID and his face went ashen. Patricia, his assistant, calling at nearly midnight. I should take he said, his voice already shifting back to business mode. Patricia never calls this late unless... Mr. Coleman. Patricia's voice was tight with panic even through the speaker. I'm sorry to disturb you, but we have a situation. The Times is running a story tomorrow morning about your mental state. Someone leaked information about your behavior patterns, your late-night office visits, your personal struggles. The warmth drained from the room like air from a punctured balloon. Richard's eyes immediately went to the twins, then to David, suspicion blooming like poison across his features. What kind of information? His voice was ice. Detailed observations about your Thursday night rituals, your emotional state, even specifics about Emily's poker cards. The reporter claims to have documentation spanning months of surveillance. Maya felt sick. Alex had gone completely still. David's face showed dawning horror as he realized what was happening. Sir, Patricia continued, the board is in emergency session. They're questioning your fitness to lead. The stock price is already dropping in overseas trading. You need to get ahead of this immediately. Richard's hand trembled as he ended the call. When he turned to face them, the grieving father was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. Which one of you did it? His voice was deadly quiet. Richard, what are you... David started. Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Don't pretend you don't know. Months of surveillance, detailed behavioral observations, emotional vulnerabilities cataloged and documented. This wasn't random. This was planned. Maya's voice was barely a whisper. We would never... You've been watching me for 2 months. You admitted it. You know my routines, my weaknesses when I'm vulnerable, and now suddenly there's a leaked story with that exact information? Alex found his voice, though it shook. Mr. Coleman, we never talked to any reporter. We would never hurt you like that. But Richard wasn't listening anymore. The walls were rebuilding themselves in real time, higher and thicker than before. The man who had shared his daughter's memory was disappearing behind the armor of wealth and power. Do you have any idea what you've done? He was pacing now, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to destruction. Coleman Industries employs 12,000 people. My decisions affect pension funds, retirement accounts, college savings, and now the board thinks I'm having a mental breakdown because some janitor's kids decided to play amateur psychiatrist for profit. Profit? David's voice was dangerous now, his own protective instincts flaring. You think we did this for money? I think, Richard said, his voice dripping with the condescension of inherited privilege, that I was incredibly naive to believe that people from your background could understand the responsibilities that come with real power. The words hit like physical blows. Maya's eyes filled with tears, but Alex's jaw set with fury. Our background! Alex stood up, his young voice carrying a dignity that made Richard flinch. You mean poor? You mean working class? You mean the kind of people who actually earn their money instead of inheriting it? Alex, David warned. No, Papa. He needs to hear this. Alex turned back to Richard, his mathematical mind cutting straight to the brutal truth. You invited us up here because you were lonely and desperate. You showed us your pain because you wanted someone to see it. And now you're angry because we did exactly what you asked. We saw you. I didn't ask to be humiliated in the national press. You weren't humiliated by us, Maya shouted, her own composure finally breaking. We kept your secrets for 2 months. We never told anyone. We watched you hurt because we understood what it felt like to be afraid of losing someone you love. Then who? Richard started, but his phone rang again. This time it was his head of security. Mr. Coleman, we found the leak. It was your ex-wife's divorce attorney. He's been having you followed by a private investigator for months, building a case to challenge Emily's trust fund allocations. The surveillance footage and behavioral documentation was part of his legal strategy. The room went silent except for Richard's ragged breathing. The twins stared at him with expressions that mixed hope with devastation. David's face showed nothing but exhausted disappointment. Richard ended the call and looked at the family he had just destroyed with his assumptions and accusations. The poker cards lay scattered on the table where Maya had thrown them in her anguish. Emily's straight flush mixed with worthless 2s and 3s. Love and loss shuffled together and impossible to separate. He started, but there were no words for what he had done. We should go, David said quietly, gathering his children's things with the careful dignity of a man who had been judged and found wanting too many times to count. David, please, I made a mistake. No! David's voice was final. You made a choice. You chose to believe the worst about us because it was easier than believing the best. Because when it came down to it, we're still just the janitor and his kids to you. Maya wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her young face aged by disappointment. Emily was right about losing being another way of winning, but she was wrong about one thing. What? Richard whispered. Sometimes loving someone isn't enough. Sometimes the person you love isn't brave enough to love you back. When fear makes us push away the very connections we need most, how do we find our way back? Share your thoughts below. They left him alone in his glass tower, surrounded by his empire and his emptiness, with Emily's cards scattered on the table like broken promises. The elevator doors closed with a finality that echoed in the hollow space where his heart used to be. For the first time in 3 years, Richard Coleman cried not just for what he had lost, but for what he had thrown away. The conference room felt like a mausoleum. Richard sat alone among the scattered poker cards, the city lights blinking 42 floors below like distant stars, beautiful, untouchable, and utterly indifferent to his pain. Emily's straight flush lay face up on the mahogany table, no longer a treasure, but an accusation. For 3 years, he'd carried these cards as proof of his daughter's love. Tonight, he'd learned they were also proof of his own cowardice. His phone buzzed constantly, board members, PR advisors, stock analysts, but he let each call go to voicemail. The corporate crisis would resolve itself. It always did. Money had a way of smoothing over scandals, and power had a way of rewriting narratives. By morning, his lawyers would have contained the damage, his publicists would have crafted the response, and his empire would continue spinning on its axis. But the family in the basement wouldn't be there anymore. Richard picked up the Ace of Hearts, Emily's favorite card, because it's like hope, Daddy. It can be high or low, but it's always worth something. His hands shook as he remembered her voice, her wisdom, her absolute faith that love was always worth the risk. What would she think of him now? The answer came like a punch to his solar plexus. She would be ashamed. Not of his vulnerability, not of his grief, but of his choice to wound the very people who had offered to share his burden. He stood and walked to the windows, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. Somewhere in the building below, David Martinez was probably comforting his children, explaining that some people were too broken to be trusted with kindness. Maya and Alex, brilliant, compassionate, brave Maya and Alex, were learning that vulnerability was a weapon that could be turned against you. He was teaching them the wrong lesson, just like his father had taught him. The realization hit like lightning. He had become his father, the cold, calculating man who saw weakness as liability and love as strategy. The man who had taught Richard that emotions were tools to be managed, not gifts to be shared. Emily had spent 11 years trying to teach him a different way, and in one moment of panic, he had chosen his father's path over his daughter's. His reflection in the window showed a man who had everything and nothing, exactly what he'd sworn he'd never become. The elevator was still programmed for executive access. He could go down to the basement level, find them before they left the building. But what could he possibly say? Sorry seemed laughably inadequate for the crater he'd blasted through their trust. His phone rang again. This time it was his lawyer, finally with good news about containing the media leak. Richard let it go to voicemail and made a different choice. He gathered Emily's cards with reverent care, slipped them into his wallet, and headed for the elevator. The basement level was quieter than a tomb. David's shift had ended, but Richard could see light still glowing from the break room. His Italian leather shoes echoed in the hallway like gunshots, announcing his approach to people who probably never wanted to see him again. He stopped outside the break room door, his hand raised to knock, and froze. Through the small window, he could see them, David helping Alex with homework, while Maya organized the papers with mechanical precision. Their movements were subdued, efficient, joyless. The easy warmth he'd witnessed earlier had been replaced by the careful distance of people who had been reminded of their place. He had done that to them. He had taken their gift of companionship and poisoned it with suspicion and class prejudice. Maya looked up suddenly as if sensing his presence. Their eyes met through the glass, and Richard saw something that made his chest constrict. Not anger, but disappointment. The kind of deep, weary disappointment that came from expecting better and being proven wrong. She said something to her father and brother. They both looked toward the door, their faces carefully neutral. David's jaw was set with the kind of protective tension that said he would listen but not forgive easily. Richard knocked softly. David opened the door, his expression polite but distant. "Mr. Coleman, is there something you need?" The formality was a blade between the ribs. Hours ago, this man had called him Richard. Now they were back to titles and boundaries, the class divide reasserted like a wall of reinforced steel. "I need to apologize," Richard said simply, "and I need to ask for something I don't deserve." David's expression didn't change, but he stepped aside to let Richard enter. The twins looked up from their homework, their young faces showing the kind of guarded caution that broke Richard's heart. "I was wrong," Richard began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Not just about who leaked the story, but about everything that followed. I was scared, and I let that fear turn into something ugly." "Fear of what?" Maya asked quietly. "Fear that maybe I wasn't worth saving," Richard admitted. "Fear that if I let myself believe you cared about me, and then lost you too, I wouldn't survive it." Alex's mathematical mind cut straight to the core. "So you decided to lose us first." Yes, the word came out like a confession. I thought it would hurt less if I was the one who ended it. David leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. And now? Now I'm here, asking for a second chance I know I don't deserve. Not as your boss, not as someone who can do things for you, but as someone who learned tonight that Thursday nights don't have to be about grief. They can be about gratitude. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that might support weight or might collapse entirely. Maya exchanged a look with Alex, then with her father. The silent communication Richard had witnessed all evening, the twin telepathy, the family unity that had both amazed and threatened him. Finally, Maya spoke. Mr. Coleman, can I ask you something? Anything. If we said no, if we told you we couldn't trust you anymore, what would you do? Richard considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I would respect your decision, and I would spend every Thursday night for the rest of my life regretting that I was too much of a coward to be worthy of the gift you offered me. Alex tilted his head, studying Richard with those analytical eyes. And if we said yes, if we gave you another chance, then I would spend every Thursday night for the rest of my life trying to prove that Emily raised her father better than my father raised me. Have you ever pushed away someone you cared about because you were afraid of being hurt? Sometimes our self-protection becomes self-sabotage. What are your thoughts? The answer hung in the air like a prayer waiting for an answer. David looked at his children, these remarkable young people who had already forgiven more in their short lives than most adults managed in decades. The choice wasn't his alone to make. The twins looked at each other, conducting one of their silent conversations. Then Maya smiled. Not the guarded expression she'd worn since his accusation, but something genuine and warm. Well, she said, gathering up the playing cards scattered across the table, it's still Thursday night, and we still know how to shuffle. 6 months later, Richard Coleman arrived at the basement break room at exactly 8:45 p.m., carrying a bag of groceries and wearing jeans that still looked expensive, but no longer felt like armor. The transformation from billionaire CEO to honorary family member had taken weeks to feel natural, but now Thursday nights in the basement felt more like home than his penthouse ever had. Papa, Richard's here, Maya called out in Spanish, not bothering to look up from the math textbook she was helping Alex navigate. Advanced calculus had given way to theoretical physics. The twins had blown through the public library's entire mathematics section and moved on to borrowing textbooks from Columbia University's library. Tell him we're in the middle of a breakthrough, Alex called back, his pencil scratching calculations across 3 sheets of paper. Maya figured out an error in the textbook's proof. Richard smiled as he unpacked the groceries. David's favorite coffee, the twins' preferred brand of hot chocolate, and enough ingredients for the sandwiches that had become their Thursday night tradition. Simple food, complex conversations, and poker games that were really about everything except poker. Another textbook error, Richard asked, settling into what had become his chair. That's the 3rd one this month. The authors assume too much, Maya explained without looking up. They think if something seems obvious, they don't need to prove it. But Alex and I learned from Papa that you should never assume people understand what you haven't explained. David emerged from the supply closet, his janitor's uniform traded for the casual clothes he wore during his dinner break. The sight of Richard in jeans still made him smile. The first time the billionaire had shown up in anything other than a suit, Maya had declared it progress toward humanity. How did the board meeting go? David asked, settling into his own chair with the easy familiarity of months of shared evenings. Tedious, Richard replied, shuffling the cards with the practiced ease Emily had taught him. But profitable. We're funding 3 new scholarship programs for gifted students from low-income families. Turns out having brilliant kids explain why education matters is more persuasive than any PowerPoint presentation. Ah, Alex said, finally looking up from his calculations. You used Maya's people need to see themselves in the story theory. Works every time, Maya confirmed, solving her equation with a flourish, especially when the story's true. Richard dealt the cards for their usual game of 7-card stud, but tonight felt different, lighter. The grief that had been his constant companion for 3 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else. Not the sharp absence of loss, but the warm presence of gratitude for having loved deeply. Emily's laminated cards still lived in his wallet, but they no longer felt like a burden. They felt like a bridge between the daughter he'd lost and the family he'd found. "Maya, you're broadcasting your hand again," David observed with paternal amusement. "I am not." "You're doing the nose scrunch thing," Alex informed her. "It means you have something good but not great. Probably 2 pair, jacks and 8s. Maya threw a pretzel at her brother. "I hate how well you know me." "It's genetic," Richard said, echoing Alex's words from their first night together. "And it's not hate. It's love disguised as annoyance." The easy banter continued as they played, but Richard found himself watching more than participating. 6 months ago, he'd been a man who owned everything and connected with nothing. Tonight, he was part of something money couldn't buy. A family that had chosen to include him not because of what he could give them, but because of who he became when he was with them. "Richard?" Maya's voice interrupted his reverie. "You're doing the thing again." "What thing?" "The grateful face," Alex explained. "You get this expression like you can't believe we're real." "Sometimes I can't," Richard admitted. 6 months ago, I thought love was something you lost. You three taught me it's something you share." David reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder, a gesture that had taken months to feel natural between a janitor and a billionaire, but now felt like the most normal thing in the world. "Emily would be proud of you," he said simply. Richard felt the familiar tightness in his throat, but it was different now. Not the pain of loss, but the bitter sweetness of love that transcended death. "I think she'd be proud of all of us," he said. "She always said the best hands weren't the ones you planned, but the ones you were brave enough to play." Maya set down her cards and looked at him with those wise eyes that had seen through his grief from the very beginning. "Speaking of brave hands, there's something we need to tell you." Richard felt a flutter of anxiety. "What?" Alex and Maya exchanged one of their looks. Then Alex spoke. "We've been accepted to the advanced mathematics program at Columbia. Full scholarships." "That's wonderful," Richard exclaimed, then paused as the implications hit him. "But that means—" "Classes 4 days a week," Maya confirmed, "including Thursdays." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Richard felt his chest tighten with familiar panic. They were leaving, growing beyond the small world they'd built together in this basement break room. But then David smiled, and Richard remembered that love wasn't about holding on. It was about letting go and trusting that connection could survive distance. "So we'll change our nights," Richard said simply. "When work's better for brilliant college students who happen to be 11 years old?" "Fridays," Alex said immediately. "Same time, same place. But maybe we could add dinner? Real dinner, not just sandwiches?" "I know this amazing little Italian place," Richard offered. "Family-owned, been around for 60 years. The kind of place where they remember your name and ask about your kids." "Perfect," Maya said, gathering up the cards. "But we're still playing for pretzels. Some traditions are sacred." Richard laughed, the deep, genuine laugh of a man who had learned that the best treasures weren't the ones you hoarded, but the ones you shared. "What traditions in your life have helped you heal and connect with others? Sometimes the simplest rituals create the strongest bonds. Share your stories below." As they packed up the cards and prepared to head their separate ways, Richard realized that Emily's final lesson had finally taken root. Love wasn't about the hands you were dealt. It was about the courage to stay at the table, to trust that the next deal might bring exactly what you needed. The twins who had watched him through glass partitions, seeing his pain when he thought no one was looking, had taught him the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best way to honor what you've lost is to remain open to what you might find. Thursday nights had ended, but Friday nights were just beginning. And in the basement break room of Coleman Industries, a billionaire, a janitor, and 2 brilliant children continued to prove that the most valuable hands in poker and in life were the ones played with love. The cards would always be shuffled. The table would always be set. And somewhere beyond the glass partitions and corporate hierarchies, Emily Coleman smiled, knowing that her father had finally learned to play for keeps.
If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.